So let's get started. Why don't you both introduce yourselves, your role at Purdue, how you pronounce your names, especially.
And my name is Lorival Monaco, also a professor at Purdue AgriCon. I'm a research manager for DIAL, the Digital Innovation Agri-Food Systems Lab.
Sure. My name is Joe Balagtas. I'm a professor of agricultural economics at Purdue and the director for the Center for Food Demand.
Great. So today we wanted to talk about the recent survey that you did about regenerative agriculture, and you found out some pretty interesting stuff. What prompted you to do the survey?
I mean, I can take a first stab at it. So in our center in Dial, we were exploring the regen ag space as far as what are the biggest problems and how can we potentially create digital solution startups that can solve those problems. But in order to know what problems we should be tackling, we needed to understand a little bit more how different stakeholders within the ag value chain felt about regen ag. Do they know what it is? Is it a positive thing? Is it a negative thing? Who does that impact, and so on and so forth. So we reached out to Center for Food and Demand Analysis to understand the consumer side of it. So that's one of the ways we started it.
Yeah, and for me, one, it's great to work with Lorival. We've got great colleagues here at Purdue, and it's in this case our interests overlap. So at the Center for Food Demand, we're interested in consumers' perceptions and experience in the food space. And that ties back upstream, of course, right? So if we think about technology adoption on farms or in the food supply chain, a lot of that depends on premiums for technology adoption, and a lot of those premiums tie back to what consumers are willing to accept or willing to pay for in the grocery store, and so while I think the science on regenerative ag is still developing, it's a good time now to start thinking about what do consumers know or not know about regenerative agriculture? What are their perceptions? And get an early look anyway about their willingness to pay, and an early estimate of their willingness to pay for these practices and technologies.
So looking over the results, I mean, I found the entire summary really interesting, but what results from the study surprised you the most?
I'll start with what wasn't surprising was the level of, or how many people didn't know exactly what it was. That wasn't surprising. I mean, maybe 70% is a little bit higher than I thought, but in the general direction. But what I found really interesting was when asking consumers who ultimately they think should be paying for this, because there's a cost, right? They said the government. Or the way we read the question informally, it's anyone but us, right? Although when they say the government, it's, we're all taxpayers. So, and it ends up being us. I think that's really interesting because it's something that people feel mostly positive about. But at the end of the day, it's really hard for people to put a price tag on it. They don't feel like, what is the value to me individually? Because it's such a common good that they feel like, all right, why am I the one that has to pay for this? Right? It's a societal benefit, so everyone should be paying for it, not me as a consumer. So the food manufacturer, the farmer, the whoever, right? So maybe a proxy for this, everyone pays for it, in the consumer's mind is the government. So that I think was a very surprising and interesting result, in my opinion.
Do you think this kind of speaks to a larger issue of the general public being so much more disconnected from agriculture than ever before?
Yeah, I think that's right. As Lorival says, it's not surprising at all that most people, when you say regenerative agriculture, either don't know what the term is at all, or have only a really vague sense of what it means. those of us who work in agriculture, we're in a little bit of a bubble. We talk to each other. We know the language, and it's easy to forget. And again, this is maybe some of the value of this research. It's easy to forget just what sort of Jane or Joe in the grocery store, average Jane or Joe in the grocery store, does or doesn't know, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's speaking to the next question I was going to ask you about some of the key misconceptions or knowledge gaps that you might have seen from your survey. And how do we, as an industry, as a seed industry, which is what I'm involved in specifically, but in agriculture in general, like how do we address that?
Well, I'll say this, and so what is it? About 30% of the of our sample actually, it says they're moderately or more familiar with regenerative agriculture. And when we ask them what they think that means, we just ask them to sort of type words, right? What do you think that means? It looks like it wasn't an in-depth survey. We didn't have a conversation with them, so it's a little bit hard to gauge what they think. But if we do sort of a text analysis of what they described as regenerative agriculture, they get that it's about soil. They get that it's about farmland, improvements in farmland. So those that do know have at least a decent sense about what regenerative agriculture is.
And adding to that, Joe, I think the biggest challenge here, specifically about RegenAg, there's not one definition that is widely accepted. And that creates sort of this gray space where people put their own perception around what RegenAg is. It can be about, the conservation practices that you adopt, like cover crops or no-till or whatever, or it can be outcomes. It can be about, water quality, soil health, whatever that means, because that means different things to different people. Or it can be about carbon sequestration. And so when you get into that space, it makes it very complicated for specifically consumers to understand what it is when the practitioners actually don't agree on exactly what it is. And I think that also connects back to the piece that the farming system and the industry overall, we're really good at talking to each other. We love talking to each other. But we're really bad at talking to consumers. And I'm not saying we need to educate them, because I'm largely against educating people. They want what they want. But I think they would be better off understanding what happens in the rest of the value chain. Why farmers do what they do, why companies do what they do.
One thing that I think that jumps out at me, I don't think it's really surprising because but it does jump out. So, what did we say? 70% of our sample is either very unfamiliar or totally unfamiliar with regenerative agriculture. Half of the sample says that they're supportive of regenerative agriculture, right? So a bunch of people who don't know what regenerative agriculture means say, oh yeah, I'm supportive of it. Right. I think part of that is Americans like farmers, right? Farmers have a good public image in consumers' eye. And so regenerative agriculture sounds like something that might be good for farmers. So we support it. Right.
That kind of was leading into the next topic as well, because I think that as ag people, we have understood terms like sustainability, organic, fair trade, and that the general public is catching up to that knowledge and they are learning what those things are. But do you think that they're confused by is there a difference? Are they comparing that and thinking this is no different? Or Laura, since you say you're not interested really in education, and educating them, how do we help them to understand?
Well, the piece around education is more us telling them what to think. We should provide information. Now, there are ways that are more effective of doing so. Put information on labels. We've seen that is not a very effective way. Some research show that consumers they don't pick up their phones and scan QR codes on packages. It's very clear. Now we do. Farmers being the cornerstone of America and being the the most trusted profession. There was a research that came out recently saying the most trusted profession in the U.S. is farming. So leveraging that perception and bringing the information of what is being done at the farm level to consumers is important, and help create distinction. Organic is not the same as regenerative, right? But there are certain overlaps for sure. So what matters to you as a consumer? What part of organic do you really like or dislike? What about regenerative you like or dislike? And then you go for those products that offer those to you and talk to you as a consumer.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd say I'd add, as the science, the agronomic science develops, and we think about and we get a better sense of what practices create improvements and who benefits from those improvements, right? I think then we could start to share that information with consumers. Consumers will have a better sense of, how no-till changes the soil, who benefits from no-till, right? Does that benefit me as a consumer? Does it make the product better? Does it make my water quality better, right? Or does it just help the farmer? Maybe it increases productivity on the farmer's land. That benefits them, but maybe not necessarily me, right? So as we define these practices, it'll be important to sort of identify where the costs and benefits are, right? That comes out in our survey. One way to think about why consumers would be willing to pay for something in the grocery store, or not willing to pay in the grocery store, but perhaps willing to pay in the form of higher taxes, is that, right? What I'm paying for in the grocery store is higher quality product, better tasting product, safer product, more nutritious product. What I'm paying for in my taxes is public goods, cleaner air, cleaner water, etc. Right? And so that could, as we think about sort of what these practices are, I think we need to think about how the benefits of those practices accrue to different people along the supply chain or to society more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people that I talk to as I travel around in our industry and outside of our industry, honestly, you say regenerative ag, and is that becoming some kind of trendy buzzword that's just part of the sustainability movement, or is this a really distinct long-term approach that really is different from traditional sustainability practices?
That's a good question. I feel like we have used many different terms for very similar things over time, and they kind of fall off favor for whatever reason. So if you go back a few years, 3, 4, 5 years, ESG, right? That's all you heard everywhere. Every single company report about their metrics on sustainability would use ESG. That has fallen out of favor for whatever reason. It feels like this company jargon that people they are hiding behind. Regenerative feels to be something that is more in vogue right now. But we have seen things like climate smart. We've seen other topics. So in the sense that it's what we're using more right now, I think it's trendy. It's hard to say if is what this is something people are going to use. And when I mean companies are going to use to hide behind and just say we're doing good stuff, because some of the companies that big CPGs, for instance, they're pulling back some of their commitments because they feel like they're not going to be able to do it. So they're changing the language to show that they're doing something, but not necessarily what they promised before. So it is trend in that sense, but I don't think the regenerative sustainability movement as a whole is going to go anywhere. That's for sure. That's here to stay.
So do you think that the findings of your survey reflect like the natural tension between what we consider functional sustainability and practical sustainability? I think you're touching on it a little bit with the conversation already, but do you think that their unfamiliarity with regenerative ag is due to the complexity of the functional aspects or how it's communicated?
I'm not sure if it could be both. Again, as I think as the science develops, maybe if we're trying to communicate, if farms and agribusiness firms and food manufacturers are trying to communicate the facts of the science better, I suspect what they'll do is move to more specific terms, right, and not talk about regenerative agriculture, which currently sounds a lot like sustainable agriculture or resilient agriculture, right? Which are just too broad to be useful. I will say, it's the confusion in consumers' heads could also be strategic, right? Or it could be used strategically, right? It might allow me as a food manufacturer to sell something to consumers that they don't understand, right? And sort of, with a label that, maybe put a halo around my product that may or may not be deserved, right? Or may not be tied to actual benefits that consumers should care about or would care about.
And adding to that, Joe, I think it's really interesting because it's not just researchers or even the market that's seeing that. SEC recently put out some regulations around what you can or cannot say on your sustainability report, because I think that is the exact point that you mentioned. It's being observed more and more. It's all about competitive advantage, right? You want to be perceived as a good brand, and using terms like that can give you that perception. So I'm not saying everyone is doing it, but there are certain people that might.
Right. And that brings about a question of ethics and using buzzwords and trendy topics to deceive the consumer, when really, I think in our industry, most people are wanting to earn the trust of the consumer. Do you see that as a problem, or do you think that the regulations are going to address it to a point where that won't happen as much?
So it is interesting. We have a colleague who used to be a professor here at Purdue, and she was researching exactly the impact of greenwashing in companies' bottom lines, basically. And she was able to prove that companies that were doing greenwashing in some level, they were doing worse than the ones that they had maybe lower commitments, but they were trying to get to them, right? So that is interesting, a piece of data. But the point is, greenwashing became a big problem. That's one of the reasons why ESG kind of fell out of favor, because it was being used as sort of this umbrella term that people were doing whatever they wanted.
Mm-hmm. So based on the findings of your survey, what are your next steps, and how do you proceed? Is it just you wanted to learn this, or is this an effort to do more?
I can start with that. So part of this work was driven because Dial's focus on creating startups around sustainability and regen ag, and because we're consumers first and users first, right? Whoever is going to be the consumer for that company's products or services, the startup we create, we needed to understand, all the stakeholders' perceptions. That is really important. You cannot start a company without learning what the problem that you're trying to tackle. So we're going to take this information to heart and leverage that for our problem discovery, ideation, and company building processes. And whatever comes out of our program, by December, we're going to have 3 companies that are going to be pitched to investment committee. They're certainly going to have that information in mind. So for us, it's very practical. It's applied research, and it's core, and it's translational in some sense too, because we're bringing, the expertise of Joe's team and very structured survey processes to create data that's going to be used for problem solving at the end of the day, and something that is going to hit the market. That's how we see that. So I'm sure that this is just the first step of this process, understanding. And even after a company potentially is being created because of this data and this research, there's always more we're going to learn. This is a very young field of study. There's new things coming every day, and it's really important for us to keep very close attention to those evolutions, and maybe do some more research to understand how things change from today into a year or 5 years.
I think in the past it was a very polarizing issue to talk about climate change and environmental responsibility, and it became a very conservative versus liberal kind of discussion. But what I'm seeing more is that both sides of that are recognizing the importance of climate change and the impacts of it, and it doesn't seem as polarizing by political party as it used to. But knowing that, do you think that there will be a tipping point where regenerative practices become more mainstream?
Yeah. We do see some political. We didn't ask. I haven't yet broke it. We have the data to do it. We didn't break down our responses by political affiliation. Is that right, Lorbal?
Yep. Yeah, we have political view between. We didn't use parties, but say liberal to conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And it matters, right? And that's similar for other issues and technologies that we've seen. So it does play in. But I think as people's lives are practically affected by changing climate, maybe that'll become less political. I'm not sure. Hard to say.
Well, we can use other countries' examples like Argentina, Brazil, and some countries in Europe that adopt conservation practices way more than we do here. And that at some point was a political, conversation, but it's not anymore. All right. I'm from Brazil, and I can tell in Brazil and Argentina, farmers are doing it because it's good business, because it's good, agronomical practice, and the sort of political bias and will you pay me to do that? That conversation, it's gone. It doesn't happen anymore. It's more like, am I doing this because it's good business? Because this is what I need to do to be a good steward of my land and produce well and be profitable? If the answer is yes, I'll do it. If the answer is no, I won't do it. And those circles can be anywhere from very liberal to very conservative, and that is outside of the conversation at this point.
Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit about the SEC earlier, but do you think that some of the research that you've done could be used by policymakers to come up with some kind of incentives that would be effective in building consumer awareness around these ag methods that we're talking about?
Yeah, I do think, you could build up political support for, carbon sequestration or for improved water quality, or for practices that sequester carbon in soil or improve water quality. And to the extent that you could generate support for policy that incentivizes farmers to adopt those practices, to generate those public goods, you kind of take the politics out of it from the farmer's perspective, right? So look, I could benefit financially by sequestering carbon in my soil, right? And so I don't, it doesn't matter what my politics says about this or that policy. I will respond to financial incentives just like anybody else.
And having said that, do you think that that's enough, like to depoliticize it? I really think like what Lorval was talking about in Brazil, that the conversation just switched pretty much from politics to, is this good for my business? Is this good for my land? And I mean, how do we get to that point in the United States to get away from the political nature of this discussion? For
me, and I'm biased because I work for a land grant university. I think it starts with the science, right? I think it starts with the science that establishes that practice X sequesters this much carbon in the ground, right? And we could establish that, and here's what needs to be done to make sure that the carbon stays in the ground. And we could quantify the benefits to society from that, right? So I think we need to develop the science further to allow that type of analysis. Then we can communicate that analysis in the public space, right? To develop public policies that encourage adoption of those of those practices.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think some of those practices like no-till cover crops, it's a technical decision at the farmer level. Who's going to make a technical decision? Is the agronomist or a politician, right? I think the agronomist with the farmer, those are the people that are going to have that conversation. So in my mind, there's no need of political view or political argument to whether you should adopt a practice or not at your farm, right? It's your technical advisor, your trusted advisor from your ag retailer, your independent agronomist, or, if you have a big enough operation, your own agronomist. Is that good for me? Is that going to help me? And then you need the data from land-grant universities and, any other sources that are trustworthy to say, hey, here in, Central Indiana, really good, do that. That works, but that other thing won't. But if you go, to the South, now that other practice, it's really good for your type of soil, your amount of rainfall. It's a technical decision. And we need to continue that, not move. The sooner we take the conversation out of the political realm and bring into the technical realm with data to back it up, the better off we'll be.
That was very well said. Very well said. And I really appreciate both of you making time for this today.